you, Alita. I'm going to ask for Lily's help with this iPad, because I think this is the way that I'm going to read questions, but it is just on the home screen. But it's a good opportunity to remind you all, please, to ask questions digitally, and if you're watching this at home, my ignorance here. Anyway, as we're getting towards that, so I'm very glad to be joined by a distinguished panel of guests representing a global spread, which is wonderful, to talk about this really key issue. So we'll have a global perspective on it. You know, as Polita mentioned, buildings are responsible for something like 40% of global emissions, global CO2 emissions, 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. Clearly, decarbonisation of this sector couldn't be more important in terms of meeting net zero targets. But this is an industry, property, construction that is enormous, complex, highly fragmented. That isn't like there are 2 or 3 big companies who are sort of pulling the way in this. It represents a significant challenge in bringing all of those people together, and potentially costly as well to move towards decarbonisation. So I was going to start really by talking to Christina from the World Green Buildings Council. You've just returned from the UN's first Green Building Summit, where you were talking about something that's quite key to this, which is the sort of the sharing of data and transparency of data, to make sure that there's a sort of level playing field across all of the various different stakeholders in this. And I just wondered if you wanted to give us a sort of brief kind of global perspective on what you learned from there and where we are with decarbonisation.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for the Financial Times for hosting this timely conversation. It's a pleasure to be also with this esteemed panel. So I do have the pleasure to have a global view on this wide industry. I am from Colombia. I'm from the South America, and I've been living in London for a few years, leading the World GBC, which is one of the largest and most influential global action networks in 80 countries. And globally, we represent 46,000 companies. And we've been creating throughout the years a lot of capacity. And there has been a lot of voluntary ways forward to create better materials, better solutions, greater specification, greater design, people-centric design, all sorts of things. And the goalpost continues to move on because nature continues to fall as our activities go. And it's a sector where the trends globally have a different pendulum. In the developed world, we know, at least in Europe, 97% of all the existing buildings will need to be retrofitted to meet Paris. In the developing world, there is expansion of the needs. Population is growing, so cities will be growing, both formal and informal, which brings different challenges for the business sector. And going to what you were asking about last week, the UNEP held the first Buildings and Climate Global Forum, where 70 countries demonstrated political commitment to this sector. And it's incredible, because in a geopolitical stressed world, we're seeing more and more national governments and city networks come together and say, we need to do something about it, because without the built environment in this agenda, there will be no viable solution to ensure a livable planet, basically. So what are the core of the conversations there? There's a lack of, let's say, of a baseline understanding of what priority actions national governments could push for. And the agenda is quite strained with the priorities piling up. So the idea is to have a political forum for collaboration, for an empathic way forward for all of us to come through and help them with understanding what standards to promote for whole life carbon and resiliency, what certifications can be more aligned towards those goals. And from our, let's say, development as a movement, we know that there's a lot that has been aligned. Last week we heard BREEAM, LEED, and the Australian standards and certification coming together and saying we're going to collaborate to bring greater transparency. And the financial sector is also saying, give me greater understanding of what are the key things for me to invest with greater certainty, because there seems to be a lot of complexity to bringing those solutions that exist at scale. with a lot of silver linings, and it's that this sector is now front and center in the energy transition. In the IEA reports, they've documented that just last year there were investments in energy efficiency, meaning using less energy, which is the critical part of the sector, right, also. On the operational side, there were 285 billion of investments in energy efficiency, basically driven by Europe in energy and security measures. But there's a trend. It's not at the scale, but there's a trend towards metrics that can get us there. So as other sectors, it's off track, but there is greater understanding and, interestingly, political will to have dialogue to get it right.
So, and Esther, from a property developer's standpoint, why is that certainty so important? What does that help unlock for you as someone who owns buildings and who builds buildings?
Well, thank you for having me. And from the headquarters in Singapore, we operate in 29 countries and regions. And our core business, including like building home, commercial property as a landlord, and also have a global footprint of 150 hotels worldwide. So what we are looking at is not just Singapore's regulations and all that. And thank you for sharing, bringing it up the heat of like the global, all these regulations. And of course, when there's global regulations, there's also national level, commitment. Mm-hmm. So we look at it from the ABCD perspective. A is really alignment with global perspective, targets, and global, race to zero. Also aligned with regulatory, because it's changing all the time. Mm-hmm. Especially in Singapore, we are well known of having regulations and and tracking performance and all that. And just a week ago, we just passed in our parliament the mandatory climate reporting disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
The guideline, not just for listed companies, but also for non-listed, the big boys with 1 billion annual revenue. Mm-hmm. And while regulations is definitely one of the top agenda, so we need to align. And then B is really a business case. You need to create value for your business. You need to look at ROI. You need to, as listed company, there's obligation for us to create value for our investors. Mm-hmm. Every year AGM, and then we have plenty of investor, meetings, and we need to showcase that in really quantified the value. Why we invest in green building? Why we invest in net zero? What exactly are you bringing back to the table? To the value. Mm-hmm. And also business case is important in a way that in a small Singapore, the next by 6 years, we're expecting the demand of 60,000 green jobs. Mm-hmm. So when you say net zero and decarbonisation, you are also providing, jobs for the economy. So C is really about collaboration. No one can do it alone. Not the UN level, not the government, not the business leader. You need everyone, especially in the building sector. Our whole ecosystem, when you talk about whole life cycle, we look at when we acquire a plot of land, how do we design, how do we make use of technologies and solutions to orientate it and also design, and how do we construct it, what sort of methods and what sort of material, and and of course how do we manage it in the end of the day, and we look at of course the heat reduction technology, energy reduction technology, efficiency and all that, and of course those do not come cheap or free. Mm-hmm. So we need funding. So how do we attract ESG investment funds, and how do we attract sustainable finance? We need D, which is the disclosure. Mm-hmm. You need it to be prompt, you need it to be aligned with global expectation. Mm-hmm. And of course, we are living in a really trying to survive this hot soup of alphabets with like GRI, ISSB, ESRS, TCFD, TNFD, the more, we can name it for another hour. So how do we as a developer, as a private sector company, to manage all these standards? And Christina just also talked about the, harmonization, standardization of green building standard. There are many, many standards in the world, and according to research, it's about 600 ESG ratings and ranking and standards and framework. Mm-hmm. So how do we survive? We have to run our business. So we need to stay calm and focus what are materials to our business, to our stakeholders, to our investors. Mm-hmm. So those are the issues that we have to look at. Mm-hmm. In a very complex world. How do we stay calm and stay focused to issues that is materials to our business. So these are the ABCD that we are looking at every day, and decarbonization, net zero, those are real issues that we have to look at. Yeah. So of course, technology and design, and we are one of the most active, supporter of World Green Building Council in Asia, and in 2021 we actually became the first company in Southeast Asia to pledge for net zero using World Green Building Council's net zero building commitment, and also at Glasgow we pledged to support the whole life cycle. Difficult, not easy. Scope 1, 2 and 3 are giving us a lot of sleepless night, but we have to do so, and without measuring you can't manage the gaps. Yeah.
And so part of this is to do with construction of buildings, but of course a big picture, as you said, Christina, is existing buildings. I mean, I think the statistic you mentioned, which I think is widely bandied about, is that a very high percentage of buildings that are going to exist in 2050 already exist today, and key to that is bringing down operational emissions. And Jose, this is an area where you're sort of your daily bread and butter as in an HVAC company. The question I was really going to ask to you is, the clients that you're seeing, are they coming to you? I mean, firstly, are you seeing more and more people coming to retrofit existing buildings rather than to make building systems for new buildings? And what is driving them to do that? Is it carbon or is it cost?
Okay, well, thank you for the questions, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I work for a company called Trane Technologies, and we consider ourselves a climate innovator. And if we think about what Christina said before, that 40% of the world's emissions are coming from buildings, heating and cooling buildings is actually 15% of that 40%, right? And buildings are continuously being renovated. Always there's building renovation. So we renovate heating and cooling systems in buildings all the time. So what we are trying to do to change our industry and to contribute to the reduction of climate change is that we are looking at, traditionally buildings have been cooled and heated with separate systems. So if you think about a hospital will have a cooling system which rejects heat, and then you have a heating system which burns some sort of fossil fuel to create heat for that hospital need. And in a lot of buildings, and hospital is one example, but there are many examples, you have this situation of simultaneous heating and cooling, and building stock has been built that these things exist in a siloed manner. So the fact that all buildings need to be renovated, and I like this statistic, 98%, we should not renovate them the way they were constructed, right? We should try to break this silo between cooling and heating, because this silo between cooling and heating is leading to enormous and obscene energy losses, right? Because every time you're running a chiller plant, which we sell a lot of, those chiller plants take heat out of the building using electricity, and then there's a boiler plant, which we don't make boilers, but people make boilers, and those boiler plants burn fossil fuels to make heat. So we developed a technology called a thermal system, which is a combined heating and cooling plant for commercial buildings and factories. And back to your question about how customers approach us usually, because we're known for cooling systems, to replace chiller plants, and 80% of our business is a replacement business, because in this region most of the building stock is built. So what we try to do is we try to advise those customers and steer those customers to say, look, we can replace your cooling plant with a new cooling plant that's going to be more efficient and have maybe a friendlier refrigerant, that sort of thing. But maybe you should spend a little bit more and replace that cooling plant with a heating and cooling plant, in which case you will not use this thermal boiler or this fossil fuel boiler as much, or you may not use it at all. And usually what happens is, and this is how we can create value through decarbonisation. I like the title of this session, right? Because sometimes people think that decarbonising is going to cost you more. But when you start to break this cooling and heating silo, replacing chiller plants and boiler plants with a combined heating and cooling plant is, because the energy savings are so big in either gas not burnt or oil not burnt, the payback on the projects are shorter than the paybacks of just replacing the traditional system in a siloed manner. So we've seen many examples of this. If I go back to where I started with the hospital, we had a hospital in Malta which was using 1 million litres of fuel oil a year. 1 million litres, and you can imagine, I think all of us know what a litre of fuel costs in Europe. It's about €1.50. So that's 1.5 million euros a year that they were just burning. And the cost of replacing that boiler and those chillers with a thermal system, and the payback on that was almost instantaneous, and then they saved themselves that money. So those kind of, the more we can build that awareness, the more we can, obviously move the industry to a combined heat and cooling approach, and the more we can decarbonize buildings. And so it's more about educating ourselves and educating the industry to design these retrofitted buildings in a different way than they've been done traditionally.
Okay. Julia, I know we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of question of value, but one thing I wanted to pick up on, something that Jose just said about we should not go back to the way that we used to build buildings. And of course, this is sort of core to the company that you work for, Gensler, which probably best known as an architecture firm, but as the section you head up is more ESG consultancy, so you're working with people across the industry, right? And I wonder if there's sorts of, is that something that in the architecture sector, the people who design buildings, they're trying to rethink, what are the ways in which we're building buildings that we need to rethink going forward?
Thank you for the question. So Gensler is a global design firm. We're designers of impact, and all carbon gets saved in design. Once it's on the page and got a planning consent, it's out in the world. So we take a first principles approach to carbon, and I get frustrated with carbon tunnel vision in these conversations because there's a species collapse going on, and we live in a system that's trying to get some equilibrium, but let's have the carbon conversation. So if you look at where we are in terms of what's happened with carbon, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Johann Rockstrom's planetary boundaries and how many we're across. That starts to tell you about how much carbon we can be using in the context of anything, let alone built environment. So then we get the global carbon budget, which breaks down to a country level. And for me, there's a bit of a disconnect around individual guidance on net zero buildings or net zero district cities versus the availability of carbon budget country by country. And to answer your question, and I think Christina touched on it a little bit, in the global north, everything is about retrofit, and that requires a different design approach to the ones that we had traditionally, which is design and build ground up. Concrete, steel, glass curtain wall, air conditioning, hermetically sealed units, and that has been a design language that's been very well adopted for successful reasons, both for stable assets and buildings that perform. And so when we now look at retrofit, we are looking at essentially heroing the carbon in the building and ensuring that we treat it with respect, and looking at how can we retain everything that can be retained, and where there's an intervention, how can that be biogenically led, and so designing down carbon. And in various instances we've had success in coming in lower than, say, 2030 standards. But it requires an architect to essentially unpick a design that may be 20 to 25 years old, and then look at where to augment it in the context of low carbon materials to give it another 60-year life. So we're spending minimal amounts of carbon to retain and make useful existing buildings in the global north. In the global south, where there's huge demand for new cities, we need to be biogenically led. We also need to be mindful that not all future cities will be planned cities. So
can I pick you up? Biogenically led, can you explain?
Grown materials. So
Okay.
Using correct materiality, and in some cases that's low carbon concrete or recycled steel. In other cases it's cross-laminated timber, or so grown materials. And understanding that contextually where we design, we need to design for climate today and climate tomorrow, and they're not necessarily the same thing. So London will have a climate of Barcelona. Very few of London's buildings were designed with a view to having a climate habitat that's correct for Barcelona level temperatures. So the last thing I want to say about that is I think one of you mentioned the word adaptation. There's how we adapt buildings. There's also how we adapt behaviour of humans to meet our buildings. We've had a history of designing buildings to meet all of our requirements. Heat me, cool me, know that I'm arriving, run efficiently, perform as an asset over 60 years. I think now we need to be in partnership with our buildings as users, and to recognise that those buildings sit in the context of an ecology. And so applying systemic thinking in terms of how we design is much more contextually appropriate. So we're a global firm with 55 local offices. Effectively, we're 55 local firms that happen to come under an umbrella of a global firm. And that's about being indigenous in the true sense of having people from that place who understand the environment in which they're operating to have correct design that's not some cultural export in terms of how it's always been done.
I think it's fascinating, and some of those design ideas, nature-led design ideas don't have to cost an awful lot. It is more about creative thinking, but of course some of those, pioneering new products, low carbon cement, for example, or recycling steel, those sorts of issues. There's a cost to that, clearly, and there's an enormous cost to some of the transition that is still needed. And so that brings us to the question of mobilizing finance, and whether or not there are sort of lenders who are convinced that this kind of change is needed, whether they're bringing new products, financial products, to sort of help stimulate this, or is this something that government does? I don't know if, Esther, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. We have read a lot of data that, in order for, to enable the world to transition to net zero, there's a need of $4 to $6 trillion a year. Okay, and there's plenty of opportunity for investment. And especially where I come from, ASEAN is experiencing very rapid urbanization. And we are now 5th largest economy, but this is set to be the 4th largest by 2030. So there a lot of developments going on. Even Jakarta is building a new capital altogether. Right. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, definitely, and there's a huge gap in terms of investment. And the latest SDG, progress report just released a month ago, we are 32 years behind time. Okay, and climate action is actually experience regression rather than hitting the targets. So there's plenty of opportunity, whether it is heat, health, human rights, labor practices, and of course, energy efficiency and all that is key. Just to give you some example that we really need technology adaptation, because gone are the day that you just play defense. Play defense, you won't win in a game, right? You need to go out and the game, right? So I think what we are believing in is actually, technologies and solutions, and what Julia said, we work very closely with architect right from the beginning, because we are 1 degree north of the equator, hot throughout the year. So how do we orientate the building? How do we simulate the cross ventilation? It makes a huge difference. Using AI, actually, it can help us reduce heat gain by 20 to 25% right from the beginning. Yeah, and then of course technology, payback is getting lesser, much shorter now. And in fact, for the past 8 years now, every year with energy efficient technology solutions and practices, it helps us save 3 to 4 million a year. And January this year onwards, our carbon tax has gone up by 5 times. So in the long run, the investment in decarbonization is going to be definitely, better than, the cost, to cover the rising energy cost, and also other, cost of inaction. And financial sectors are the key driver. We have seen that, 2019, the Net Zero Alliance of all the investors, asset owners, and then in 2021, July, Net Zero Alliance for Insurance Company. And that is a very important, initiative, because building owners like us, we have buildings that we want to make sure that it can be insured, otherwise it will become stranded assets, or the premium will not cause us a big dent in our bottom line. Okay, so the third one, which is actually during Glasgow, the alliance, the Net Zero Alliance, Banking Alliance is very important. And in Asia, the sustainable finance just last year has grown by about 60%. You know, it's huge opportunity. And now banks, when I first issued the first green bond in Singapore in 2017, a lot of local banks are not in the conversation.
Right.
So a lot of European banks are the one that we go to. But in the end, we launched it with a local bank, the largest bank, DBS, in Singapore for refinancing a green bond. But since then, we have actually, seen the tremendous growth of financial sector. Now, sustainable finance, transition finance are all becoming mainstream of most banks, Asian banks, Singapore banks, and all. And of course, we have GFANs, regulators, and then a lot of financial institutions are part of GFANs. So when the financial sector move, the businesses will move.
Right.
Yeah. So.
But then I suppose also the financial sector is going to be looking to businesses to give. I mean, this sort of actually goes back to what you were talking about, having a common set of standards. If you're in the finance sector, you're looking to mitigate risk. You might view this as a sort of slightly risky investment because of the multiplicity of standards and codes and complexity of supply chains. But this is something that the industry is attempting to do, right? It's to give a little bit more certainty to the financial sector about.
Yeah, I would say that totally. There's a total commitment to bring total certainty or greater certainty for the financial community to discriminate what is a quality asset fit for purpose, and depending on the maturity of the portfolio, how is the compliance with that high performing hierarchy that we need today of the built environment, but also make sure that the dialogue trickles down even to spreading out the innovations, not to go very far away, the green mortgages. We're here today in the UK, and just a few years back there was just a few banks giving out green mortgages, meaning that you would get lower interest rate or more loan if you would go for a house that was energy efficient or had some attributes. Now there's dozens, and you can even go online and you can say, I'm going to buy this house, what would it take to improve it? And now there's greater information for the consumer to understand that is a better quality house, because in the life cycle I will be more comfortable in it, I won't be wasting energy, and that's, let's say, the basic business case. And as you scale that, and as you get sophisticated in all those movements that Esther was describing, basically the big asset owners, pension funds, the big, those big portfolios are discriminating on buildings that are performing in a pathway towards decarbonization versus assets. The stranded assets are the ones that are not going to be our low performers, and we require investments to be bankable, because the risk of stranded assets is because climate is here. They won't be comfortable to be operating in. They will be too wasteful, and you won't be complying with all the ESG metrics if you have a bad performing building. So that's how I would like to explain it. And then the one key thing for you to remember also is that the investments in built environment will continue on and on. It's one of those sectors that continues investing. It's not one of those that just, there's a change in the market. There may be a little bit of stop and go, but it continues to happen. And right now, there's the wrong signal sometimes, and money is going to the wrong assets. So going back to the introduction of this political momentum that happened in the forum last week in Paris, basically governments are saying, help me have a conversation to how can I be better at giving the right policy signals, the enabling policy environment to mainstream quality buildings, locally appropriate, but that are helping me achieve the Paris Agreement goals, my own goals towards having solutions for my people. It's basically, it goes to basic empathy. To people will need a roof over their heads wherever they are in the world, and so the finance will come, and that's the alignment we need.
That actually, we have a question from a viewer, which I think speaks to something, because the public sector plays a role in that, right, as well. And I wonder, a question really for the panel. Can you give examples of effective policy incentives that have helped or that are helping to decarbonise the built environment? I mean, I don't know, Jose, this is something,
Yeah, no, I think
particularly this is
there
an
have
area,
been,
heating has been an area.
like there's been a lot of policy around decarbonising heating, for example. So, like, you know, some cases subsidies on heat pumps versus fossil fuel
And
heating
the IRA
systems.
has some tax incentives.
In the US, yes, but in Europe as well. There, you know, and in Europe, actually, these subsidies started well before the US in some countries, especially in the southern Europe, in Italy, Spain, France, these kind of places. So we see that there has been, and that has driven a lot of the shift from, you know, boilers to heat pumps. But I think there can be even more put in this policy type arena to drive the shift. And you know, I think everyone is aware about pollution, right? And nobody likes pollution. There are lots of rules around, you know, you can't just go and dump rubbish on the street, or you can't go and dump, you know, toxic waste into the ocean. And these are all things that are sort of common sense for us. And there's a lot of regulation around the emissions, tailpipe emissions of cars, and even, you know, let's say NOx emissions from boilers, this sort of thing. But I think one area which would really drive the, you know, the change in mindset for people and awaken people to the opportunity here that exists and all the funding is available for, is really to put what I term as thermal pollution, right? There is so much heat rejected, either from, you know, it can be a building or it can be a factory, and nobody sees heat rejection as pollution. But that heat, if you can recover that heat, and there are technologies to recover that heat, and you don't need to recreate it either from burning a fossil fuel or through electricity from a heat pump, then, you know, if we start to look at thermal heat rejection and thermal pollution in the same way we look at direct CO2 emissions, I think that can help drive a lot these sort of technologies, because the technologies exist today to really eliminate fossil fuel heating, but we don't do it because, you know, there's a certain traditions in the industries that we are in, and I think we need to put more value into that. What is that thermal pollution? And that will help drive maybe trying to recapture heat more, which will decarbonize a lot, because anytime you waste heat, anytime you're creating heat, you're creating carbon to create that heat, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Could I give an example of
Sure,
the
of course,
Singapore
yeah.
government? Very clear, the so-called Singapore SG 2030 Green Plan. We set very clear target for green building. 80% of all building in Singapore, whether old or new building, has to be Green Mark certified and you know, achieving certain level, and 80% of all new development has to be super low energy building. That means it's 60 to 70% more efficient than the, you know, building code. So all these are very clear. Next 6 years.
Right.
Now we're only above 50% all buildings, so we're looking at about another 30% to achieve the national goals of 80%.
So-
and that is where the building and you know, construction authority have to push really, really hard, and it become a license to operate because it is regulations.
But it's interesting because you're
Yeah.
talking about both carrots and sticks then, right, in a
Yeah.
way. It's, you know, it's a way that actually it's not just about incentives, it is also
And
about
that will
setting-
also offer a lot of push for green financing, because in order to green your building, whether old or new building, you need to look at technology. You
Right.
need to you
Yeah.
know, mobilize capital. Yeah.
I think, if I may, I think what's going on in the built environment right now, the state of where we are, is there has been some great leadership from global companies like yourselves. And you've shown the way, and we have shown that solution exists, that it is possible. But it does seem that that enabling policy environment, like in Singapore, that they're front runners in that, we need more of that. Need more clarity than for the finance to flow to the right sorts of solutions, right? So we have greater dialogue, and that continues to scale. Just this Tuesday in the European Commission, the Energy Performance Buildings Directive was approved in a very important vote, and it's going to be ratified by May. It has a mandate for a disclosure of whole life carbon impacts, life cycle assessments, mandatory disclosure, so there's going to be data at the EU level, and there will be a mandate for everything to go towards zero emissions buildings. So if you get and there's a little table there worth billions for the sustainable finance community, because it has the thresholds and the goals to meet and the pathways for the buildings to perform. So those sorts of signals will bring clarity, and then the metrics are cleaner for the energy part of the transition, and we must not forget that there's much more there to create a good quality building, but in that carbon
tunnel vision.
That's where right now the priority is, because that's what's heating, in the name of this panel, that's what's heating us up, because we haven't solved it. The energy part is burning us in this sector.
I think, forgive me for 1 second, but
Sure.
you asked for a planning response, like what's the public sector requirement for this type of heat recovery to happen? And the problem is fragmented ownership. So there isn't a requirement to recover energy from an office building to pump it into an adjacent housing development, because no one's ever asked for that to happen, and it didn't form part of the planning between either the office developer or the housing estate similarly. So the requirement is now for us to use our imaginations and to not look for a planning authority to tell us that we should do that, but actually to say, do you know what, I've got waste heat here. How can that be used usefully in my community? We have ESG disclosure. The key to that is S, right? So how do we look to that exhaust as a form of pollution and say, who else's opportunity is that, and where do we funnel that in a way that's meaningful for the communities around what we're doing, and be much more systemic and much more holistic about being inclusive with the wealth that is concentrated into certain assets.
But who drives that in the value chain then?
Honestly, I think it ought to be everybody. It should be clients. We're advisors. People come to us to dream the world into being, and so our job is to dream the world into being in a way that says, hey, have you thought about there's a systemic way to approach this, there's a planning way to approach this, there's an investment. This is all of us.
May I give an example? This is a great point you bring up. We had a client, I think everyone knows data centers and AI, it's booming, right?
Yeah.
AI is powered by data centers, and data centers consume a lot of cooling, and they reject a lot of heat. We had a data center in the Netherlands where we were doing the cooling system, and we brought together the municipality. There was a school next door, and there was a gymnasium. And the school needed heating, and the gymnasium needed heating for the swimming pool. And with the municipality, we agreed as a consortium to build a hot water loop around the data center, the gymnasium, and the school to recover the heat from the data center. And the school and the gymnasium get heat for free. But it requires, as you say, everybody to be aware, first of all, that this energy is being lost, and then have that like-mindedness to go and say, how are we going to think creatively to bring it together? But I think one way to make people aware would be, I'm sorry to say that point again, is to say thermal pollution has a value.
Interesting.
I was hoping to give some time to questions, but we're very, very nearly out. I think I've got one last very quick question, if someone wants to engage with this, and maybe this is one for you, Esther. Someone has asked, how can we aid sustainable buildings in emerging markets where it's seen as pricey and focus on growth and development amid frustration towards the north?
Yeah, actually when we talk about decarbonisation, we tend to just talk about energy, renewable energy, reduction and all that. In fact, we've been looking at more nature-based solution, and greening and water feature, green feature can help us really cool the interior space a lot. So we have been working with our tenants, working with our contractors and suppliers and all that to increase. Actually, most of our residential development, we have about 60 to 70% of site area devoted to green, because Singapore is really hot if we don't have the greenery, and we are one of the highest in terms of green coverage, and that really help. And plus, technology is really helping. Like for example, the cool paint that we have piloted very successfully in our Phuket development. It actually, over 1 year's test, it actually can bring down temperature by about 7 to 8 degrees Celsius. So we look at nature-based solution, we look at really technologies that not really the rocket science, not just energy, but circularity, regenerative solutions are the future. So nature-based solutions is what we're looking at.
And I think that goes back to your point about thinking about the ways in which we have relationships with buildings. So I think that's a nice way to come to an end. Thank you so much for giving your time and your thoughts today. And I'm going to hand back to Palisa, who's going to take us through to the next section.